Welcome, everyone, to this panel in our Barbara Carkaby Living Archive series sponsored by the Friends of Women's Studies and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at the University of Houston. It's co-sponsored by the Class Special Committee on Race and Social Justice and the UH Asian American Studies Center. I'm Elizabeth Gregory, Director of the WGSS program and the UH Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. The Living Archive series aims to present a sense of the complex history of women's lives in Houston, and the Friends support the WGSS program with scholarships, fellowships, and much more. Today's topic also intersects with the concerns of our Yayen Lee Endowment, which is focused on the experience and needs of refugee women in the Houston area. Our topic today is anti-Asian racism and sexism, responding to both the recent murder of 6 women of Asian descent in Atlanta on March 16th, and to the 150% rise in anti-Asian reported hate incidents, many of them violent, that has occurred in the US since the start of the pandemic in the context of the racist language utilized by the former administration. 3,800 incidents were recorded in the last year, and many more went unrecorded. 68% of those were against women, more than double those against men. We are privileged to have a distinguished panel here today to discuss the current dynamics and the background against which they occur. And I will now introduce our moderator, who will introduce the panelists. Professor Shepa Masango Shari is a South African scholar specializing in African history with a focus on racial formation, radical politics, and religious expression. Her research connects African radicalism with Black nationalism in the US, and she writes on gender, sexuality, and violence as well. She is well positioned to explore the issues raised by our topic today. Professor Shari, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gregory. It is my honor to welcome all of you here today to discuss anti-Asian hate and sexism. I have a distinguished group of panelists, and I will very briefly offer you introductions. However, I urge you all to take a moment and look in the chat for a larger biography that you can get a sense of where each of these panelists are coming from. First, I'd like to introduce Debbie Chen, Esquire, the Civic Engagement Programs Director of OCA, Greater Houston. Deborah Y. Chen is an immigration attorney at the law offices of Deborah Y. Chen and Associates and a longtime community activist for more than 20 years. She serves on the board of OCA Greater Houston chapter, where she co-founded the Houston AAPI Film Festival Committee and co-organizes OCA Greater Houston Advocacy Center's monthly citizenship workshops, pro bono legal resource guide, as well as a biannual National Asian Pacific American Elections Exit Survey that Houston cites. Please look on our chat section for more information. In addition, I'd like to welcome Dr. Liz Yu Chow, who is a clinical investigator who has maintained continuous funding from the NIH since receiving a Mentored Career Development Award from the National Cancer Institute in 2006. She has a myriad of interests, and I'm sure that we will cover them to a certain extent in our discussion today. However, I'll just raise a few: that she does work and research on HIV-related immunosuppression on the cancer incidence of HIV-infected individuals. She also addresses poor cancer outcomes and HIV-infected individuals, along with HPV-related cancers. Next, I'd like to welcome Professor Karen Fang. Karen Fang is a professor in the Department of English, the chair for the University of Houston's Class Initiative in Media and Moving Image, and contributes to the Engines of Our Ingenuity, an NPR program on culture and human creativity. Karen Fang is a film scholar and critic who writes about the intersection of Eastern aesthetics in global culture. Her most recent book, I think, is very timely to our discussion, which is Arresting Cinema, Surveillance in Hong Kong Film. That's by Stanford University Press, 2017. It looks at scenes of social and spatial, as well as data monitoring in Hong Kong. And of course, last but not least, I would like to introduce you to Professor Yali Zong. She is a professor of education, leadership, and policy studies, and the University Endowed Professor for Global Leadership Studies. She is also the director of University of Houston's Asian American Studies Center, which she established in 1995. Her research includes cross-cultural, transnational understanding, ethnic identity formation, and minority student academic achievement. There is so much more that I could say about each of these panelists, but I'm sure you'll get a sense of who they are as we begin our discussion. Before we start our discussion, I do want to mention to all of you the format. I plan on posing a question and then having all of our panelists respond accordingly. And what we hope is that this will be a roundtable, an opportunity for an initial discussion about issues that really we have been waiting to have in full display here at the University of Houston, of course, in our city, Houston, and beyond. So I'll begin with this question. Given this sort of history of Asian violence and racism in the US, and this killing as one example against a background of increased violence and aggression against Asian Americans, how can we understand the role of xenophobic rhetoric contributing to this? And I'll open the floor to any one of you. I think we'll start with Yali. Please make sure to unmute your mic. We'd love to hear all that you have to offer us.
Thank you. I think there are several factors that have contributed to this surge. One is that US has more than 200 years old history of exclusionary policy and practice. And discrimination, hate language, and hate crimes against AAPIs. The history of bigotry and the xenophobia in the US especially contribute to this rise in anti-Asian violence and hate. The second factor is the introduction and the assumption around the term modern minority during the civil rights movement, which forcefully suggests that the Asian American are more successful than other ethnic minorities, that they are studious, law-abiding, and upwardly moving group. So this myth became an obstacle to the social justice movement as far as AAPIs were concerned and hindered advancement of equity for Asian Americans. The third factor is the use of racist rhetoric by some politicians to describe COVID-19 virus, the Chinese virus, the Kung Fu, exacerbated a situation in which all racial ethnic groups were already feeling vulnerable and fearful of this contagious virus. Racist rhetoric incited discrimination and ignited violence about AAPI. Just stop here.
So, to echo what Dr. Zhou just said, racism and xenophobia against the Asian community has always been there, right? From the beginning of this country. There were Asian Americans here in the Civil War. We don't know about that. And that goes back to the fact that our general education system, our history books don't really talk about the contributions of minorities, other than, a few paragraphs. I mean, there was a controversy just a few years ago, right, where, African American slaves were described as workers, and you might have one sentence in a book about how the Chinese built the railroad, but nothing about how historically Asian Americans have been used or pitted against other ethnic groups, right? So in the 1800s, we were called literally the model minority race, in the sense that Chinese workers, worked too hard. They worked so hard that it was unfair for white workers to be able to compete against them. And so that was actually used as a basis to enact these blatant racist discriminatory laws, restricting Chinese workers from being able to live in certain places or work in certain industries. There are land laws in this country that still exist on the books that Chinese or Asians are not allowed to own land. Most people don't realize that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act came about as a result of basically an agreement between politicians in the West and politicians in the South, saying, well, it's okay for you to discriminate against the Chinese and all subsequent Asian groups who came in. There were different laws enacted for them. It's okay for you to murder and kill and discriminate against them. But at the same time, then you're going to keep your mouth shut about the Jim Crow laws in the South and discrimination and murdering an entire race of African Americans. Like, these are just examples of that intersectionality of how our communities of minorities have been historically pitted against each other or used against each other. And that continues to this day through the 60s with the model minority myth, where we are basically used as a wedge against other groups.
We are drawn as humans to identify differences between ourselves and our tribes. And for it's just that this visual difference is linked so closely with disease and discrimination. It's an ongoing thread definitely through US history. And I imagine probably through other countries where there's a long history of Asian immigration, Australia, and other countries where Asians have immigrated from. But this particular moment in terms of COVID is, I think, sort of a perfect storm, an unfortunate coincidence of events, that this particular virus did arise, was first detected, I should say, in China. But again, this whole class of viruses has been around for several decades. And, and had this been MERS, what would have happened if MERS had been the virus that had caused the global pandemic? Again, there would be scapegoating again for probably people from the Middle East. So it's sort of like a kind of a perfect storm of the historical and the geographical and political intersectionality.
And I'm sure we'll continue discussing public health in some form or fashion, right? In some ways, this is what has allowed us to have this virtual event. But I do want to pick up on the thread that all of you have talked about, this kind of stereotyping that has lended itself to this kind of violence. And I'm curious about how you see this anti-Asian violence. Is it part of the same kind of violence that we're seeing against Black and Hispanics? Or is it different? What's the distinction there that we can make? And can you also help us understand the gendered component that we just saw in the past Atlanta shootings?
I'll wade into that. It's multifaceted, right? Because of the stereotypes of, the exoticism and fetishes of Asian American women, I think that contributed to, just violence against women overall. right? It's just this was the way to target Asian women specifically, or Asian Americans, that contributed to what happened in Atlanta. But overall, I think Asian American women, because there's a stereotype of them being more, quiet or smaller or docile, that makes them more likely to be profiled even as, victims of crime, whether it even rises to the legal definition of a hate crime, right? And then you look at how violence has happened against other minority communities, and you could theoretically extrapolate and say, for the different types of violence that other communities experience on a regular basis, that many Asian Americans experience similar things, but maybe for a different stereotype, right? Like many years ago in California, I'm just blanking out on the name of the exact case right now. A man came out of his house holding a broom and was shot to death by police, claiming, well, they were afraid that he was going to attack them with kung fu, right? There are, in California especially, for a long time, where Asian American men were profiled for driving in rice rockets. And so because they were driving around in rice rocket, like, those fancy little souped up cars, they were, potentially a gang member. Is it as prevalent and widespread compared to the African American community? No, simply because we don't have the same demographic numbers. But is it the same, basis on race and stereotypes? Absolutely, right? There's, 2 cases right now where, this is a struggle within the Asian American community around law enforcement. And it's, it's on both ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, there are many people in the Asian American community who feel that, we need protection. Who is going to speak up for us or protect us or step in if not the law enforcement? But then at the same time, you have, instances like, what I just pointed out of law enforcement who may not have, frankly, the same resources or training that was made available about, community, enforcement or community policing, or just understanding cultural biases and differences that we all hold, or understanding, mental health issues, right? There are cases in all communities where people who have mental health challenges, right, their families call 911 or call the police because they need help. And then it ends up where, because there's miscommunications, there's lack of training, there's misunderstanding about what mental health really is, someone ends up being shot and killed, right? And there are cases like that in all of our communities. So it's hard for me to say definitively that there are hate crimes happening against, an Asian American versus an African American or a Latin American that is completely different, when they actually have this underlying thread. It's just the biases are different.
Yeah, I think another way of sort of specifically focusing on this issue, today's panel issue about sort of like violence, racism, and respective populations or race groups in America, right? And what is the relationship or the difference, the comparison contrast between, say, the racism, the racial experience of African Americans, particularly in terms of its intersection with crime and the law, and Asian Americans, right? And so I think if we sort of talk in experiential terms, like I think the African American writer Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about, he has written about an experience that I understand many African-American parents sort of talk about as like the talk that you have to have with your young son about, your visibility or hyper visibility, because you're always going to be the one who's suspected. Like you have to be extra good because people are always going to suspect you of something, even if you aren't actually doing anything. And you have to be, when a cop pulls you over, don't do all of these things. Like African Americans, right, the particular way in which like their historical racial experience becomes like visualized and objectified in one particular body in terms of the law and the vulnerability of the body is particularly the vulnerability of the African-American male body before the law, right? And the law is like will to control or to exercise this power over that body. For Asian Americans, right, it's slightly different. As you pointed out, like we are often objectified through our women, not through our men. And the stereotype is that we're weak, we're frail, we're submissive, and we're available sexual objects, right? And so, you know, Asian American parents never had to worry necessarily about vulnerability to the law and vulnerability to violence, right? We maybe had to worry about the fact that we wouldn't be considered, like the law wouldn't listen to us or attend to us in the same way, right? We, you know, Asian Americans as a group don't report crimes against themselves, you know, as much as any other racial group, right? You know, but what's been interesting, I mean, a terrible thing that's consequence of our historical moment now is now our bodies are starting to look like African-American bodies, right? Because now we're targets of violence. But like in the case of the Atlanta shooting, right? The bodies that were like, you know, the victims of that tragedy were they were victims because of, you know, arguably this history of sexualized objectification. And the violence, I would add also in the tragedy against this woman is not only that they were killed, but that people can't take it seriously, right? By saying it was, you know, the killer had a bad day, or, you know, simply accepting the explanation of sex addiction as a motivation, you know, or you know, extenuating, you know, circumstance or context for the killing.
Okay, I really agree with Dr. Fang and Tony Chen's statement. Obviously, there's violence against Asian Americans, but maybe like both of them discuss in a different way. Some people in this society, because have not recognized the racial issues against the Asian Americans. And sometimes Asian Americans keep silent, you know, when they are mistreated. But this time, there is not enough enormous evidence to show the violence, discrimination, aggression against Asian women, Asian Americans. There's so many data there, but I want to use our own research to show that, because recently we have a research conducted by our doctor students, sponsored by Asian American Study. Our doctor students like Rosa Na, Ivy Bachman, Christine Landman, to study about university student realized experience. So in the study, among 2015 responses, 83% indicated that it is more common for people to express racist view against AAPI during the COVID-19 pandemic than before. 88% reported there has been an increase in hostility towards Asian Americans because of COVID-19. 45% respondents reported experienced other individual acting uncomfortable around them. So students also report being invalidated for their collectivistic values. In most cases, students didn't defend themselves when they were made fun of because they fear of their safety and repercussions. Additionally, high numbers of Asian females reported being stereotyped as freaks in bed. So you just think in last years, like 68% of incidents against Asian women compared with 29% involving men. So sadly, we see so many people just were killed and hurted. So it's time for our society to recognize this anti-Asian violence and speak out, discuss the issues like today we discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to add to this conversation, this very fruitful conversation about the ways in which Asian women are being presented, right? So this notion of the submissive and sexualized Asian woman, and sometimes we see this, and we've seen this in films. So The World of Susie Wong, Miss Saigon, and in a different light, I think The Crazy Rich Asians, which is one of the more recent films. And so what I am hoping that you can help us understand perhaps is a transgenerational discussion, because as we've had this increase in violence, 68% of the people who are reporting the kind of microaggressions, harassment, violence have been women. So this stands in some kind of contradiction, right, between what is portrayed and what is actually happening in terms of moving our needle and understanding anti-Asian hate. So can you all weigh in and comment on that?
Since it's about film, I should probably start this off. So, you know, so there's films from the 50s, The World of Susie, China Doll, like Flower Drum Song. A lot of that was a sort of direct response to American foreign policy at the time. So America was interested in expanding and protecting their sphere of influence in Asia. And so, and also remember, they also had a whole population of servicemen who had returned from the Pacific Theater, and and during the World War II had been encouraged to seek R&R in places like Hong Kong, and they were familiar with sort of comfort women, and and so there was an experiential notions of Asian sexuality that had entered into American discourse, had been revived during World War II, right? Because that had also been in place again during the exclusion era, when there were brothels, in the Chinatowns, because exclusion prohibited women from coming to the US. And so the Chinese businesses would import women, and there would be these brothels in Chinatown that served both white and Chinese men. But it becomes particularly like the sexualization of Asian women, I should say, becomes sort of like domesticated and naturalized in a highly visible way at mid-century, partly because of it's consistent with American foreign policy. And so over and over again, you see these films at these times that repeatedly show a white man, usually played by William Holden in World of Susie Wong, right? Seducing an Asian woman who falls for him, right? And this is sort of a romance of American expansionism, right? And because it's given this Hollywood gloss, it seems like it becomes a naturalized discourse. It seems desirable, right? And one of the reasons why Asian women, are often seen are seen as sort of like highly sexualized. It's not only because there's this long material history that validates that, but also because in sort of heteronormative, long-standing notions of what is considered attractive in Western discourse, right? Like thin, small, soft-spoken, hairless, right? All of those attributes that are have been valorized as sexually attractive in the global media, right, are attributes that Asian women, phenotypically fulfill, right? So when you lump in sort of historical legacies, phenotypic attributes, right, a population for cultural and demographic and legal reasons who don't seek, who don't fight back and seek representation and or are seen to be as such, and a geopolitical discourse that also corroborates that, right? It's very difficult, you can imagine, to see Asian women as not, outside of that stereotype that's being presented. And so that's sort of those are the predecessors for the moment that we're in today. The question about something like Crazy Rich Asians, I think, is really interesting, because like the Asian body in global media has really changed in the past 10 or 15 years. Asian bodies are almost like one of the least represented racial groups in global media, and particularly in Hollywood, which still largely remains the sort of most influential media form, right? So Asian stars and actors have the least number of lines, like, in Asian characters get the least number of lines if they appear at all, right? In mainstream media, right? They're always the sidekick, or, at best, like they're never the star, right? It has started to change only because of the global economic clout of China. And in fact, right now, China is funding is the most lucrative source of media in the world right now. And so Crazy Rich Asians, was intentionally created on the part of its maker, a former creative writing grad, who's very transnational, very sophisticated, that he's a member of this new sort of transnational elite. He knew that he was trying to represent a different side of Asian America. He knew that it was going to have available to him a different media market at the time that it was coming out, right? And certainly we see that in its success, but its star, Constance Wu, is very active on social media, and she's been quite vehement throughout her stardom about sort of the issue of Asian American representation. And so I think we have far to go, right? Asian Americans in global media, in Western media, still don't command the time on screen or the investment or the as African Americans or even Latino stars, right? And especially considering the fact that African Americans or Asian Americans have higher disposable income and the most educated racial group in America, right? Why don't we have a media representation commensurate to that? The needle is starting to move, but obviously it hasn't moved enough.
I have a question for you, Karen, about that. And my question is that because, maybe Asian Americans don't spend their income on, film, right? Like maybe there's a way that that we as a group have come to understand that we are, that's not our role, or that's not, that we don't, spend our money in ways that entertain and sort of, in terms of other, people or our family values, or, I'm just curious that, I wonder if there's that, even though we have a lot of spending ability, if that doesn't somehow either, again, the invisibility issue, right? Is it because we're actively being excluded, or is it partly also that, again, we're just not, we're not vocal, we don't, there's not a lot of in terms of, I imagine that there are fewer people going into media. I'm curious about those kind of statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I can have an answer to that. And I also want to turn it back around to you because I have a version of it that I think is perfect for you. So yeah, I mean, the reason why the needle is starting to change, I think, is precisely because, I mean, it's generational change. The geopolitical, the global balance of power has changed, as I alluded to earlier. So I think the older generations of Asian Americans, they may have had the income, but they didn't spend the money, as Liz points out, because, you didn't have a lot of choices back then. If you were when I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, I was going to watch the Cosby Show, or I don't know what else, the one with the girls, the Facts of Life, right? That's what was available to me. If I was going to wait around for something that represented me, I was never going to have anything to watch on TV, right? But it's, but now you know, you start to have more people who are demanding something that looks like them, right? And you also have a sort of industry that's more aware of the clout of these, you know, not only the consumers, but also the financiers, right? Which is a point that I had made previously as well. And so you see this, and also like the nature of media has changed. So now it's no longer broadcasting, there's a lot of narrowcasting. So in YouTube, right, there, you know, Asian Americans coincidentally, you know, tend to be, you know, unusually highly represented amongst like the YouTube generation, right? And so certainly that's, you know, so we start to see these changes, and I think that, you know, hopefully that will, that the move of the dial will continue. But the what I wanted to say to you, Liz, about in terms of reversing or a version of this question is, I think, you know, one of the contexts or one of the insights of, I think, the media example that I'm familiar with, right, is basically what you're asking about is people don't change unless they see their own interest, right? Like, you know, like still white Hollywood, which is still predominant white, you know, the power still, you know, power still mostly resides among the white establishment, right? Like there are huge inroads on the parts of other kinds of like populations and major players who are not like white or male, right? But it's still, you know, the majority still remains within the white establishment. But like, how do you make change happen until like the establishment sees that it's in their interest to change, right? So that's why media has changed, right? Become more inclusive, become more diverse, right? Because they see how it can help their bottom line. And I think, you know, like when we get to go back to the specific issue about the moment that we're in right now with anti-Asian racism, right? I mean, you know, the irony of the whole like infection Chinatown disease discourse that is so long lasting and that was revived during the pandemic, right, is that actually, right, didn't the Chinatowns, you know, throughout North America have lower rates of community spread and infection, right? You know, and I think, and one of the reasons why people think that is partly because, you know, they obviously, you know, we're all embedded in transnational networks through our relatives, right? Or through different language news media, like Dr. Zove can probably talk about, right? You know, and so there was a sort of awareness and early prevention, right? You know, and familiarity with SARS and bird flu and swine flu, right? And so, you know, and so ironically, there's 2 points about sort of like the effect of transnationalism and why the rest of us should change because of it, right? Is because it's in your own interest for public health, right? For future profits, right? To be aware of like what's going on, right? To be insular, to be within your American silo, your white establishment silo, doesn't serve that establishment anymore. It endangers you in terms of public health, and you lose out on the bottom line.
That's a really, really good point. Yeah, I think that, you know, if you think about it in terms of transnationalism and disease in general, you know, there's you know, Asian people have the longest longevity in the US. So there, you know, that, and like you said, a lot of our networks, we knew early on that this was going to be, and took precautions early on, and so, right, like in the Chinatowns, there was definitely lower spread. But, you know, the other interesting thing is that, you know, there are data to suggest that even though we may want to become transnational and more open, I think it's very difficult, right? And I think the opposite actually ends up happening, which is that we end up looking more like the insular American. And I'm just going to show a couple of slides that are related specifically to health. So there was a recent article from the Annual Review in Public Health that shows, hold on, that they looked at particularly Asian women and men, and sort of what their life expectancy looked like. I'm sorry, I didn't put the first slide in, but it basically shows that everybody's life expectancy increases till about 2015. And then everybody's life expectancy plateaus basically in the this is all US. So this is in the US, and you can see then what they did was they divided it by year, how much of a change that occurred between 2014 and 2017 in terms of the mortality, right? So negative means that there was more mortality, and then positive means there was less mortality. So for every gender and for every race, there was overall more mortality from 2014 to 2017. And even though, you know, if the sort of overall life expectancies of Asian men and women increased in general and were the highest in general, we still saw the same amount of decline in, or increase, I'm sorry, increase in mortality, decline in life expectancy. So we're becoming more like, you know, our insular US. And then one other thing I wanted to draw attention to is this slide, which really struck me. This is age-adjusted death rates for suicide. So this is changes in suicide, and you know, non-Hispanic white women in particular are really there's a big issue with suicide in that group as well as in men. And you know, people have called these the disease. This is a, you know, sort of deaths from opioids and from despair. But you see that among women, the second highest group of suicide rates is among Asian women. And you don't see that among men. So, you know, again, I think, you know, we as Asians are becoming more like our US, insular US group. Then it's hard to make these big changes.
Thank you for that. And thank you for bridging sort of our discussion really about gender, but also about health. And so one of the things I want to move on to is really sort of thinking about, is sort of thinking about our positionality now with the sort of the transgenerational response to this anti-Asian violence. And so what we've seen, at least in Oakland and throughout California, is we're seeing not just a response to the police, right? So not just reaching out to the police, but communities are organizing. And, you know, how do we make sense of Asians with attitude who are patrolling Chinatown? You know, so how do we understand this new generation's response to the violence that's ongoing? And perhaps we'll start with you, Yale, perhaps because you have been dealing with a lot of graduate students, but also some of our young people at UH who are part of Asian American Studies. Don't forget to unmute.
So we can see that everywhere in many cities of states, so people, Asian American groups with many ethnic groups together demonstrate, you know, against anti-Asian hatred, discrimination. So this coalition fighting, united fighting, really help us to discuss the issue and move our issues to the center of national dialogue. That's great. We also can, because I think the most important, we need to organize a lot of research, use our data to show that the stereotypes, the bias, the discriminations, to educate our public. I'm so happy to see our Houston Asian American communities, like Debbie discussed her organizations, and Chinese community centers organize a lot of activities. And together with our center, we all slogan is, we are not the problem. We are not a virus. We are the solutions, because we organize a lot of activities to raise the money to salute to first online heroes, to help those people who are in financial need, and to organize a lot of education webinar to talk about the issues. So this is kind of activity we need to do, because in order to eliminate discrimination, in order to create this hate-free society, we need to speak up. We speak out. We need to address the issues. We need to present what history, US history, deeply rooted in this racist discrimination. So if we don't educate public, who will do that? So that's why I think it's our collective responsibility to do something, to talk, to do research, to organize activities, to educate the public, and to create this hatred-free, harmonious society. We should work together, stand together with many ethnic organizations, with Americans together to create this discrimination-free society.
Thank you so much. Debbie, would you like to weigh in?
I agree with everything that Dr. Zoe has said, right? The thing that I would add to that is, when I get a lot of questions from people like, well, what can I do? How can I help, right? And the first things that everyone's talking about right now is intervene, right? Get yourself trained to be comfortable to intervene, and to speak up. If you see something happening, speak up. Make sure that the person who's being victimized knows that you're there to support them, that they're not alone, right? That actually goes a long way towards someone's mental health, is to not feel that they are alone and no one cares. The other thing would be, to definitely report it, right? Regardless of whether you think anything's going to be done, we need to actually report it and document it, to be able to say that there is a problem that needs to be addressed if it's not being reported or tracked. But the last thing I would really emphasize, everyone, is, and this cuts across all communities, right, is that everyone needs to step up and be a more active, civically engaged citizen. And especially in the AAPI community, because a lot of, Houston especially is majority first generation immigrants, right? So you're talking about an entire population of people who don't necessarily come from countries where it's okay to actually go vote safely, or to even be able to vote, or to call the police, right? And not have this fear that in the middle of the night, someone's gonna come and haul you off to God knows where. That it's safe to do that, to vote and to report. But most importantly, to register and vote, because ultimately, whether it is money, resources to communities for mental health, or community education, or for law enforcement support, like all of that comes down to policymakers. And if our policymakers, our leaders in Congress, and the Senate, if they don't fundamentally believe or demonstrate by their actions that they believe minorities and Asian Americans are equal citizens and human beings in this country. And I use that specific language because last year, Representative Grace Meng from New York put forth a resolution. And this was just a resolution, like a public statement, right? just asking for people, our leadership, to make a public statement that hate crimes against Asian Americans, scapegoating of Asian Americans is wrong. It wasn't involving any money, wasn't involving any policy, right? This has nothing to do with partisanship, has nothing to do with politics. It is simply a statement saying Asian Americans are equal human beings and valued citizens in this country and should not be targeted. And 164 of our leaders in this country did not vote to say, yes, Asian Americans should not be, targeted. Asian Americans should not be scapegoated. So that raises the question fundamentally of, do Asian Americans actually have power or are viewed as having a voice and a say and a seat at the table, in any table, to actually be able to determine what policies and what kind of influences there are going to be when it comes to issues that are going to impact our community? And hate crimes, right, cutting across the Asian community, all minority communities who suffer from discrimination should be able to feel that they are valued as equal citizens. And so I say to everyone who I talk with is, yes, support community organizations, give them money to support doing bystander trainings and doing community education. But before you even put your money where your mouth is, go and register yourself to vote, and then actually go vote. Vote for the people who are actually going to care about Asian Americans in this country when they're thinking about policies that are going to impact us.
Thank you so much. You are so right. We need to hold people accountable and we need to report. And Professor Feng, right here from UH, did so some years back. You all can find a link to her article in which she had a disturbing exchange via voicemail from someone else, actually just really a model of how close and near this kind of violence, microaggression is to all of us. Yes, so absolutely report and vote. And I think to that end, this notion that Yali was raising about coalition building and working together speaks to a question that was brought up by our audience members. And the question is the Asian American community working together, though they come from various backgrounds?
There are different members of the leadership of different organizations. I can at least say for the organizations that are more civically engaged, we have a coalition or a collaboration called Empowering Communities Initiative, ECI, where different organizations from representing different ethnic Asian backgrounds, we work together on a regular basis to try and encourage everyone to register and go vote or get their citizenship, and to serve as a space. Like last year, we were very, very involved with, making sure everybody gets counted for the census. And then this year we're working together, on hate crimes awareness, on, food distributions for, people who suffer from the power outages of, Winter Storm Uri, as well as on redistricting, right? And ultimately, our goal collectively is we want Asian Americans to be represented at every table, to have a seat at every table, and to not be there just as the token yellow face, right? But to actually have someone there who understands the needs of our community and who are going to speak, and represent us well in a way that is engaging and recognizes the intersectionality of our communities and people who are lower income and limited English proficient.
Follow-up question is, are Asian Americans working together with other communities of color to combat racism together?
Absolutely. This is the one thing I say to everyone. A lot of times you do not see as many Asian Americans at some of these community tables because they're held during work hours. And in the entire city of Houston, there's literally a handful of organizations who have paid staff, and a couple of those are paid staffs of one. And so a lot of times they're not able to go to every single community meeting. But several of us who are in this coalition, for example, are part of the Houston Coalition Against Hate. We were there as a part of its establishment. We plan to be there in perpetuity. And right now we actually, are partnering with them to offer bystander trainings every month So you can go to, Houston Coalition Against Hate's website to see that OCA is also providing additional situational awareness trainings that will begin in the Houston area in September, as immediately after the bystander trainings are completed in that series. But I think a lot of people in our community were extremely moved last year, after George Floyd was murdered, right? And the subsequent, highlighting of other people who have, experienced that, and their families are having to deal with the aftermath of having a family member who was murdered. I can say that for myself personally, for OCA Greater Houston, for the first march that was organized by Black Lives Matter, we were there and we were able to support with 2,000 face masks and hand sanitizers, and just with the limited resources that we had, we wanted to share that, right? I hope that all of our community continues to do that. I know that with Dr. Yali Zoe, what she referred to, there was an effort by the Asian American community last year. We raised $160,000 to supply meals to frontline workers. And we made a conscious, deliberate effort to target hospitals and clinics and grocery stores where we knew minority communities go to those establishments, right? And minority communities are the people who work in those establishments. And so we wanted to very visibly demonstrate, a lot of the work that, frankly, that whole coalition came together because we knew all these different groups were donating stuff, donating PPP or donating PPE, but not really talking about it, right? So we were like, let's come together and try to, distribute this stuff and at least let people know that the Asian American community is just as invested as everyone else is.
No, thank you. I actually want to take us, we're running out of time. There's so many great questions here from our audience members, and some of them want a bit more context in terms of historicizing a few points that you all have made earlier. So one of the questions, this is a very large question, but I ask you to be very brief in your answer, because I imagine and I hope that this is the first of many conversations that we will have. We cannot just relegate these conversations to be an urgent response to a shooting. They need to be ongoing and multifaceted. So the question is, can you please discuss the history of US militarism across Asia since the colonization of the Philippines in 1898 and warfare/occupation, this is including spaces like Japan, Korea, Vietnam, to examine the material and practical links between US imperialism and the sexual exploitation of Asian women? Let's have it. Any one of you all can weigh in. I imagine, Debbie, we have belabored you quite a bit. So any one of you all can jump in.
Well, I feel that I sort of answered that already when I was talking about the films in the mid-century films and the ways in which they were romanticizing American foreign policy and the sort of like post-war like notions of Asia and Asian women. So I don't know. I mean, I can go into more media examples, but I mean, I think basically in summary, right? I mean, the Philippines is longer because it goes back to the 19th century and it has more to do with the labor and territorial interests. I mean, it precedes communism and the world wars. So, I mean, it's a little bit different. I mean, and the Philippines is like the sort of historical case that everyone cites as an American imperialism, like in the sort of comparable to the British or French context, where it looks like a settler colonialism. Right, rather than just kind of a foreign policy sort of, I forget the Cold War term, like beachhead. But certainly by mid-century, by the 20th century, right, America's military and foreign policy interests in the Asia-Pacific region, right, are primarily oriented towards sort of maintaining American interest, right, which is capitalism. right? And so it's sort of like it's a strategy of containment against communism. So Asia becomes this vulnerable site in the eyes of the US state, because China, which is this powerful country, has turned communist. And so they're afraid that the rest of the countries, the non-aligned countries, are going to fall in under the influence of China. And so American foreign spending and military interest like stays and mounts in the Asia Pacific region for that reason. And so America continues to have this sort of like direct experiential relationship with Asia on the part of its servicemen and the people, the foreign policy workers, right? And then it also becomes visible to Americans at home, as I've said, through this sort of mass cultural media like Hollywood movies.
Okay, thank you so much for adding to that, especially with the context of the Philippines. And I just want to add, as we're talking about coalition building, the Philippines was this one site in which you had African-American soldiers defect from the US Army and support these means. And I think oftentimes we just do not bring this into our history books. We do not discuss it in class. And so there is this kind of notion of the division between all these various groups of people who at various points have worked together. But I will actually push forth and ask this other question just as a representation of our audience members who are here and want to engage with you all as best they can. And I think this will be our last question as we get to the close of this discussion today. But what do you see as the relationship between the first legislative act, the Page Act of 1875, which was aimed at Chinese women to stop immigration for the purposes of stopping, quote, immoral behavior, end quote?
The relationship between the Page Act and now?
Yes, and specifically for the purposes of stopping immoral behavior. So how can we maybe it might help us tease out this notion of a sexualized Asian woman that we had been discussing earlier on.
Professor Zoe, do you want to take that, or?
I'm not in that field.
Okay. So the Page Act, I mean, first of all, the Page Act precedes the Exclusion Act of 1882, but it was not the first anti-Asian law that the US government passed. Like, there were a series of laws preceding the Page Act. So, I mean, I can't remember the various, like, the exact names or the exact dates, but, there were already laws, restricting, like, imposing requirements, restricting, imposing requirements of literacy and capital, like, restricting them from owning land, owning property, testifying in court, testifying, like mandating habeas corpus, like, considering their death equal to the death of a white person or even a slave, right? Like, I mean, there were a number of legal instances, like, prior to Page. So the best way to think of Page's movement was to legislate or to restrict the arrival of female Asian bodies, but it was only one of a series of acts, right, which is part of America's overall history of exclusion against Asian bodies, right? And so, but the Page Act is particularly important, right, because it again sort of goes back to what we were saying about the particularity of the female body in anti-Asian racism. As when we talk about the intersection of race and gender, if African Americans, like, are particularly represented, as I said earlier, through the power and the vulnerability of the male body, like the stereotype of Asian race, in the white American Western historical consciousness is of, like, the sexual body of the Asian woman, right? And so, and we talked again about, like, why that is, because of the brothels, because, in the Chinatown brothels, going all the way up to mid-century American military and foreign policy interests. And so the Page Act, like, is one of these series of exclusion laws, but the one that most dramatically tries to enact exclusion by regulating the dangerous and seductive the female Asian body.
Thank you to all of you all for taking us both near and far in our understanding of a very complex issue. I do lie. I have one last question, which is, what is our way forward? You know, I can't just leave this forum having put out with you all the major issues at play, at least for this moment. But what do? You know, we have this forum, we have this discussion, we have you all as experts, but what can we do as we leave this meeting?
I would say a couple things, right? One, if you are a citizen, register yourself to vote. If you have a green card for 5 years, get your citizenship and then register to vote. Support Asian American organizations that are doing this type of work, because frankly, most Asian American organizations are under-resourced. And there's a reason why there's only, literally a handful of organizations that have staff. We don't get the same kind of support from even across foundations in this country. Like we literally get, the last statistic I know of was we get less than 0.4% of all foundation money in this country, right? We don't even get 1%. We're 0.4%. But for those of us in Texas, long-term, right? One of the things that we ought to really consider is, one of the projects that OCA is working on is looking at having AAPI curriculum adopted by the State Board of Education. And we are, essentially copying what the Latinx and the African American communities have done. But the step beyond that, of once you have these type of ethnic studies, curriculum available, is to actually have teeth in it, because right now it is just an elective and it's not considered, it's not mandatory. There's no mandate that every student in the state should take some kind of multicultural ethnic type of studies course as a high school student. And those courses are not classified as high enough in the, so if you're a student and you're concerned about your GPA, for instance, are you going to take a class that's going to give you a 6.0, or are you going to take a class that's going to be a 4.0 if you have all those ranges of electives, right? Some people will look at that. But the other bigger issue is Texas is the second biggest market for history books, social studies books after California. So we should be looking at, and the Texas Board of Education, when these books are being designed, what is actually included in it, right? Because if we were to say in Texas to make sure that our history books here and social study books have the inclusion of minority communities in those textbooks, our histories and our contributions, then because we are such a large market, that will basically mandate what textbooks get sold in the rest of the country, because publishers make a business decision to use the textbooks that are through Texas and through California because of financial reasons, right? They're not going to print multiple versions of the same book. So that is something I would encourage people to really think about, is how do we educate our future generations? That, I believe and hope, would really go a long ways towards eradicating hate and everybody actually valuing the contributions of our diversity here in America.
Yeah, I support you. Excellent statement. I think after the discussion, our conclusion is that racism, sexism is a virus that really poison our mind and destroy our unity of the country. So what we need to do? We stand together. We speak out anti-Asian discrimination or hatred. We go out to vote, and we need to change our curriculum, our history education. Asian American history is a part of nation history. Our narrative stories need to be heard if you don't put there in history textbooks, but the history textbooks to represent Asian from hegemonic ideology perspectives, we need to use our own story to teach what is Asian American history. So in a summary, we need to address the issue. We need to take actions. What action? Engage community activities, doing research, persuade public to work together and make racist, sexist, free society. This I want to say. Thank you.
Liz, do you want to say anything? Are you going to say anything about health?
Well, I mean, you know, to be aspirational, again, the idea of trying to be, you know, we all learn from each other. That I was really struck when you said about transnationalism and really trying to bring a transnational approach to health to the U.S. and, you know, a global vision. And it starts with education. It starts with diversifying our workforce. It starts with unity. And so it's not specific. There's no, I'm not, you know, I agree with everything that Debbie and Yali have said. So already, you know, we have to, you know, do what we can locally, right? Think locally, act globally, or act locally, think globally. So what we do in our own communities is to, you know, reach out and work with the members of our community. And we hope that we can bring a better perspective to the community that will, you know, reverberate into the larger dialogue.
Yeah, I wanted to say, you know, even though the reason that we're all speaking today is, first of all, the terrible tragedy in Atlanta, and then generally this huge upswing in terrible acts against Asian Americans, like from, you know, other kinds of assault to just sort of verbal assault, right? Like this is the main reason for our conversation today. The thing that I want to leave people to think about in ways that they can help is to think about microaggressions, because there's actually a direct line, you know, from microaggressions, like very small, like slurs or, you know, seemingly like off-color comments, you know, or just like, you know, praise, you know, like stereotypes sort of couch like praise, like the, you know, model minority thing, like that there's a direct relationship between microaggressions and, you know, terrible acts like the Atlanta shooting. And so, you know, for everyone, whether you're Asian American or, you know, someone who wants to be an ally, I think we need to think about more often about like these very mild things. You know, one of the reasons why the sexualization and objectification of Asian American women has gone by unremarked for so long, or unremarked outside of the Asian American community, right, is because in some level it's supposed to be seen as you know, positive, like you're desirable, you know. With the rise of online dating, Asian American women were the single most desirable group, like from among all races. So like, so, you know, so you know, we need to be more self-aware of the ways in which like any kind of thing can enable and perpetuate a perception, you know, an objectifying and disrespectful and baseless representation, baseless understanding of a person or a population or a gender or race.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. I want to give a special thank you to Professor Yali So, Professor Karen Fang, as well as Dr. Liz Yu Chow and Debbie Chen. I want to just alert you to a couple of things in your chat. Should you want to connect with Asian American Studies, you should have the information available for you. We urge you to do that, whether it's simply just joining a listserv. Please do so. As well as if you want to support the efforts of OCA Greater Houston, the information is also in the chat as well. I want to thank you again for your time and your attention. I hope that we will meet again in person in some version so that we can actually feel all of the things that are connected to this. It's not simply just research. These are lives and they matter. Now I'm turning it over to Professor Gregory for her close.
Thank you, Shepa. And thank you, all of the wonderful panelists. There's so much to talk about. And clearly talking about it is part of the way forward, right? Just having these conversations and raising all the points that people were raising is essential. And just a note back to what you were noting, Debbie, about textbooks. Textbooks are political in Texas. What you were saying makes absolute sense, but the reason that people are not represented there is because people have made choices not to do that, right? So diversity is here, but our legislators need to hear from the people that we need to be represented and that we want to see all groups represented there. Otherwise, it won't happen, even though it makes perfect sense that it should. Same, I will say, is true of women's studies. Right? People don't want to talk about gender, or some people don't. But it's key to, and it's something that all young people really want to know about, right? So race and gender and the intersectionalities of that are essential for textbooks. I agree. And I wanted to let people know that we have 2 talks upcoming in April that we hope you'll join us for. On the 15th, we'll have the next talk in the class Race and Social Justice series, and our speaker will be Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. We'll be talking about racial capitalism, and that's at 3 p.m. And on April 23rd, we will welcome back former WGSS postdoc, Dr. Sarah Luna, who will give a talk about her new book entitled Love in the Drug War, Selling Sex and Finding Jesus on the US-Mexico Border. So please go to our website and look for details on those. And again, thank you very much to all those in the audience who have attended and to our panelists for all the good work that you do, and to our moderator, and hope to see you soon, continuing the conversation. Bye-bye.